How did it happen? And why did it cause so much damage? Was it arson, a baker's negligence, or an act of God? Now, using contemporary forensic techniques and new historical evidence, we can piece together the true story of the Great Fire of London. In 1666, London was a tightly packed city of narrow streets and crowded lanes, home to 300,000 people, 1/16 of the population of England. Contemporary writers referred to the city as a great smoking wen, a place of fear and flames, disease and dread. London was a fire city, and flames were everywhere. Cooking, boiling, burning, baking, lighting and heating. Homes and streets were filled with tinderboxes, gorse bushes, striker lights, candles and charcoal braziers. There was also something particularly ominous about the year 1666.
It is actually extraordinary that the fire should have happened in 1666, because for the previous almost 10, 15 years, people had been worried about what might happen in 1666. It was regarded as the most dangerous year because 666 was the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation in the Bible. And there had been all sorts of predictions about what might happen. And of course, the years around 1666 were absolutely ghastly. There was the plague, which is pretty bad news, 60,000 people dying, and plagues had happened before, but this was a very, very big one. There was the fire. The fire year was a very bad year. It had been a very, very hot summer, which of course contributed to the fire. There was then this ghastly autumn where it poured with rain, with everybody living in shanty towns, and then the winter was the coldest winter that had been known for 20 years, and everybody then froze. So there have been an awful lot of awful things happening, and that's completely setting aside complete and utter military humiliation at the hands of the Dutch in the Second Dutch War. I mean, England was at its lowest ebb, and right at the bottom of the deep pit was London.
The country could hardly have been more unstable. Strange comets had been seen in the sky, observed by the astronomer Christopher Wren, who kept a nightly vigil, tracing their path.
The sense of portents of some kind of impending disaster was extremely strong. And if you remember that telescopes, particularly precision telescopes, were a new phenomenon, to be able to look at a comet which has appeared brightly in the night sky, to be able to track the progress of that celestial body across the sky is in itself a new and exciting and unfamiliar thing to be able to do. Couple that with the long historical tradition of unfamiliar events in the sky portending some kind of danger, adversity, disaster on Earth, and you have the conditions for a very, very nervous atmosphere in the months preceding the Great Fire.
Everywhere, the streets were seething with fanatic sectaries, preachers and prophets, prophesying doom to Babylon, which was the most common way of describing London life if you rather disapproved of it, and threatening in particular, and there are all sorts of contemporary broadsides and books, threatening in particular fire, which of course in the scriptures is associated with judgment. He will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. The people, said the prophet Isaiah, the people will be fuel for the fire.
The Quaker preacher Solomon Eagle walked naked through the streets with a bowl of fire and brimstone on his head, warning that the people were doomed and the end of the world was nigh. His message was simple: repent or burn. Fire had a symbolic hold on the 17th century imagination. It was not only dreaded on an everyday basis, But it was also seen as the principal mechanism for the end of all things, as if one spark could set off a chain of disaster, bringing hellfire down on Earth itself. King Charles II was so concerned that he wrote to the Lord Mayor, warning of the ease with which a conflagration could take hold. He gave royal authority to imprison all those who flouted building regulations and reiterated the need to be watchful. Houses should be equipped with buckets and ladders, and churches should act as rallying points. But although everyone seemed to know that disaster was imminent, no one could foretell exactly when, how, or why an ordinary, everyday fire would turn into a conflagration. On Saturday, the 1st of September, 1666, the King's baker, Thomas Farriner, was preparing for the Sabbath. His bakery lay in Pudding Lane, a narrow alley famed for its sellers of sweetmeats, pastries, and of course, puddings.
Pudding Lane was a fast food area, really. There were probably cookhouses as well as bakers and other food purveyors, and very busy at all times of day, particularly at midday when people wanted something to eat. There'd be cook shops, which were like open kitchens where you could buy a pie or a piece of roast pork very, very cheaply and wander off down the street eating it. And people would be roasting on spits. I mean, you're not talking about one little spit with the joint on it. You're talking about 4 or 5 spits with 2 or 3 little boys turning them, each spit with about 6 joints on it. So you might have, 15 joints in front of a fire. So what you have is an enormous fire, and sometimes going up canopies that were made of wattle and daub. Sometimes the actual chimneys were not made of brick at all. They were hood fireplaces made of wood covered with mud, and sometimes they went up in flames. It's a dangerous place, Pudding Lane.
On the night of September the 1st, Thomas Farriner retired to bed, as a contemporary fire account observed, leaving his providence with his slippers. It was the last night of Old London. The fire started between 1 and 2 in the morning. It was first noticed by a journeyman sleeping above the ovens, who awoke to find his bedroom filling with smoke. Once it took hold, any Londoner knew that the first thing to do would be to evacuate the building as quickly as possible. But by the time the alarm had been raised in the rest of the house, the Farriners found the stairs impassable. They fled up to the roof space. Here, their maid was too frightened to jump down onto the cobbles below, and became the first victim of the fire.
It's disorientating. A building you may have lived in all your life will become unrecognisable in the smoke. You cannot see. Your eyes are streaming, there'll be pain in your eyes, choking. You will not even remember the way to the door or even the window of the room you were in extreme cases. It's extremely frightening and extremely dangerous.
By 3 a.m., the fire was visible in the street outside. One of the best accounts can be found in the diary of Samuel Pepys, Clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board. At 3 a.m., he was woken by his maid.
Lord's Day. Some of our maids sitting up late last night to get things ready against our feast today. Jane called us up about 3 in the morning to tell us of a great fire they saw in the city. So I rose and slipped on my nightgown and went to her window and thought it to be on the back side of Mark Lane. But being unused to such fires as followed, I thought it far enough off, and so went to bed again and to sleep.
This was apparently just another fire, When the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, visited the scene, he remarked that a woman could piss it out. But the heat in the room was now far greater than the flames suggested. Once in the streets, the fire began to spread in 3 different directions. Down Fish Street Hill, into Thames Street, and into Mark Lane on Tower Street. Any firefighting equipment proved useless, and because Londoners worked a 6-day week, resting on a Sunday, most people were asleep. By the time the alarm was raised, the fire was too great to be put out by buckets of water. At 7 a.m., Pepys was woken again and told of the dangers of the fire.
By and by, Jane comes and tells me that she hears that above 300 houses have been burned down tonight by the fire we saw, and that it was now burning down all Fish Street Hill by London Bridge.
The bridge was actually a very densely packed structure. It was only 12 or 13 foot wide, and of course the houses are so famous that are built along either side of it, left a tiny narrow passage in the middle, so it was absolutely begging to be burnt down in a way, and in fact it had been. It had been burnt down in 1633 at a fire that had destroyed really 2/3 of it, but had been stopped at the drawbridge, at the very defensive thing that kept people out. And so the Great Fire in 1666 behaved in exactly the same way. It tore down the bridge, but stopped, and then, in a sense, more or less turned back on itself and blasted back into the city.
The only way to stop the fire now would have been to pull down houses and create fire breaks in advance of the flames. But the mayor hesitated. Who shall pay the charge of rebuilding the houses? He insisted on gaining the consent of the owners, who, seeing the flames still far off, refused to pull down their homes and businesses. Samuel Pepys now went to Whitehall to warn the king that this was the only course of action possible.
So I was called for, and did tell the King and Duke of York what I saw, and that unless His Majesty did command houses to be pulled down, nothing could stop the fire.
On that morning, when the fire was discovered, it could well have been on top of this building that Charles went to get the view. He'd have seen it from the top of here, just across the bend of the river. He would have seen the smoke and flames. He would undoubtedly, when he realized the severity of it, begun to be a little bit concerned about the fire making its way towards Whitehall and threatening this edifice, the embodiment of Stuart rule.
Returning to the city, Pepys now met the mayor, who had been so dismissive at the start of the fire.
At last, met my Lord Mayor in Cannon Street, like a man spent, with a scarf about his neck. To the King's message, he cried like a fainting woman, "Lord, what can I do? I am spent. People will not obey me. I have been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it."
For the preachers rising early on Sunday morning, it was as if everything they had foretold was coming true. Thomas Vincent referred to the fire as God's terrible voice in the city.
Never was there the like Sabbath in London. Some churches were in flame that day. Such warm preaching those churches never had. Such lightning dreadful sermons never were before delivered in London. Now the fire gets mastery and burns dreadfully. and God with his great bellows blows upon it, which makes it spread quickly and go on with such force and rage, overturning all so furiously, that the whole city is brought into jeopardy of desolation.
The fire was now out of control, threatening the entire city. Londoners began to worry whether it could ever be put out, and if this was, indeed, the end of the world. By Sunday night, 18 hours after the fire had begun, Londoners abandoned hope and began to evacuate the city. The price of a cart to carry possessions rose during the next 3 days from £3 to £30. One of the keenest people to preserve his goods was the diarist Samuel Pepys.
About 4 o'clock in the morning, my Lady Batten sent me a cart to carry away all my money and plate and best things to Sir William Ryder's of Bethnal Green, which I did, riding myself in my nightgown in the cart. And Lord, to see how the streets and the highways are crowded with people, running and riding and getting of carts at any rate to fetch away things.
Despite the chaos, there was little sign of panic and few casualties. Most Londoners knew that the safest thing to do would be to flee the city, but the narrow, winding streets made a mass exodus at speed almost impossible.
Having seen evacuations in Africa, having seen it in the Balkans, some people are extremely methodical about it. In some ways it helps to calm them, that they know they're going to have to go, but nonetheless they go through a logical, sensible thought process and take things like food with them, clothing, extra clothing or less clothing depending on the climate, water, all the necessities of life, but they are very much in a minority. The majority of people will be wholly irrational with what they take. I've seen people carrying decorative bits of furniture on hand carts away from these sorts of difficulties and disasters, utterly useless pieces of equipment for which there's no logical use, but has a sentimental value rather than anything else.
Samuel Pepys noticed that each time people felt they had found a place of safety, they were forced to move out, further away from the fire.
And among other things, the poor pigeons, I perceive, were loath to leave their houses, but hovered about the windows and balconies till some of them burned their wings and fell down.
The silversmiths hid their plate deep in the sewers. Sir William Batten dug an enormous hole for his hogshead of fine wine, while Samuel Pepys buried one of his most secret treasures, Parmesan cheese, newly imported from Italy. As many as 100,000 people had left the city walls for Moorfields, Islington and Parliament Hill. They slept in open fields with few possessions, some tented, some in shacks, but most exposed to the sky.
There were no pre-prepared sites, there were no rendezvous, there were no sites that had food, water or housing ready for them, and we know that eventually they set up tents and other forms of temporary accommodation. But the worst possible thing would have been people crowding into areas with no sanitation, no water supply, no food supply.
By the time the fire reached Lombard Street, the financial future of the capital was in jeopardy. Its entire wealth was made up of gold coins, which had to be physically carried out of the city before they melted away.
This street has been the nerve centre of London banking for 700 years, and so it was as the flames of the Great Fire started nibbling at the end of the street. The bankers who were living here performed a crucial role, really, in the running of the country, and certainly in the life of Charles II. It was they who were providing the loans, both for the financing of the Dutch war, but also for the royal household. And so as their houses started to be consumed, they only had one thing on their minds, and that was gathering together the coin, the gold coin, that was so fundamental to London's economy, and just getting it out of the square mile.
By 3 p.m. on Monday, the second day of the fire, Lombard Street had been destroyed. Although houses were now being pulled down, the remains were not cleared. This vital failure meant that heavy timber frames lay in open roads, allowing the fire to cross whole streets. By 9 o'clock on Monday evening, it had reached Baynard's Castle on the waterfront. The flames were higher than they had ever been. An onlooker, not known for his mathematical skills, vowed that they were 50 miles high. The heat travelled so in advance of the flames that it was almost impossible to pull buildings down, and the city was covered in a curtain of smoke and heat. At daybreak on Tuesday the 4th of September, after 55 hours, the fire was at its most furious point, and Cheapside was in flames.
If the bankers of Lombard Street were lucky enough to get their gold out, the vast majority of shopkeepers here on Cheapside certainly weren't. I mean, this was the absolute shopping centre of London, and it went up in flames in an afternoon. It was as if Regent Street and Oxford Street just disappeared between the hours of midday and 6 o'clock in the evening, and there wasn't a hope of the majority of the things being saved. And of course, by the end of that afternoon, you could stand here and you could look over towards the river, and you could see it. For the first time since Roman times, you could see the river from Cheapside.
This was the third and worst day of the fire. It was now 10 times the size it had been on Sunday night.
Rattle, rattle, rattle was the noise which the fire struck upon the ear round about, as if there had been 1,000 iron chariots beating upon the stones. And then you might see the houses tumble, tumble, tumble from one end of the street to the other with a great crash, leaving the foundations open to the view of the heavens.
If you were downwind, then you'd see nothing. You'd just see a great pool of smoke with flames licking up inside it, which in some ways would be even more sinister. But I think if you could see, if you were off to a side or upwind of the fire, wonderful buildings, churches, other institutions, suddenly with the flames licking round them, reflected on the billowing smoke, and indeed possibly at night time even more spectacular, suddenly those buildings collapsing, has been desperately demoralising.
When you have a fire of the intensity of the Great Fire of London, the effects on the environment are felt way beyond the confines of the city itself, so that 3 days after the outbreak of the fire, 60 miles away in Oxford, an astronomer, Mr. Locke, became aware that the sunbeams shining through the clouds were tinged with a curious pink or red because of the smoke and ash that had drifted all the way from the seat of the fire.
Scorched silk was found in the River Thames at Henley, and burning papers were seen in the woods of Windsor. Lady Carteret, out walking by the Thames, stooped to pick up a burnt fragment of a book. The words read, "Time is, it is done." Back in the city, the great medieval icons of London, such as St. Paul's Cathedral and the Guildhall, were now under threat.
The Guildhall, together with London Bridge and St. Paul's Cathedral, was one of the great civic symbols of the pride and economic prosperity of the city. And so as the flames reached that, I think there was a sort of double blow, really. First of all, this was one of the other great icons falling, but also for the city government, it was an incredible humiliation. Not only had they failed to stop the start of the fire, here was the seat of all the civic pride, pomp and pageantry of London going up in flames.
By Tuesday night, after 72 hours, the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral.
Old St. Paul's meant a great deal as a presence because the houses were very small and this enormous building loomed over everything. Old St. Paul's was larger than the cathedral we have now. So you have the physical evidence early in 1666 of this enormous cultural revolution which had actually occurred over the course of the previous century. And old London, Shakespeare's London, this insanitary, vibrant, overcrowded London, was also a London dominated by the mouldering and decayed shrines of a great ecclesiastical church culture.
Amazingly, St. Paul's Cathedral was covered in wooden scaffolding, awaiting its restoration by Sir Christopher Wren after the spire had been struck by lightning. Wren had even suggested only months before that the best thing to do would be to pull down the building and start again from scratch. On Tuesday night, the roof began to melt. It spewed out molten lead, crashing down into the masonry and statues below.
Now the lead melts and runs down as if it had been snow before the sun, and great flakes of stone scale and peel off strangely from the sides of the walls.
An old lady taking shelter became the next victim of the fire.
Near the walls of St. Paul's, a human body presented itself to me, parched as it were with flames, whole as to the skin, meagre as to flesh, yellow as to colour. Her clothes were burnt, and every limb reduced to a coal.
The king now rode through the fire. He carried 100 gold pounds in a pouch swung from his shoulder and scattered coins among the workmen in encouragement.
The king's role in the fire and the rebuilding afterwards is almost the most interesting thing about the Great Fire of London. He got his hands dirty. Here was somebody who was the restored King of England, really presiding over one of the most magnificent, lavish, gay courts in Europe. There he was, going out and personally taking control of this hideous calamity.
The king now gave orders to move the exchequer to Surrey, while his brother James, the Duke of York, called in the navy to fetch gunpowder. Pulling down buildings was to no avail. Sailors from the fleet and workers from the dockyards at Woolwich and Deptford were now ordered to blow up buildings in order to create fire breaks. It was the only way to save what remained of London. At last, on Wednesday morning, after 4 days, there were signs of hope. The wind was stilled, and the fire breaks seemed to be working.
By the Wednesday, the fire finally hit something that it couldn't burn, and that was the temple, the great brick and stone complex of lawyers' lodgings which clustered around the temple church. The Duke of York came down. He was actually a bencher of the inner temple, and he came and presided over the last series of explosions, last bits of demolition, which finally stopped the fire dead in its tracks.
Although sporadic small fires still raged, by midday on Wednesday, September the 6th, 1666, the general conflagration had at last been put out. Samuel Pepys climbed to the top of Barking Steeple to survey the damage.
There saw the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. Everywhere great fires, oil cellars and brimstone, the fire being spread as far as I could see it.
He goes to see where his school was, and the school had been so important, his formation of the school, which had been Milson's school, the school from which he'd gone to see Charles I executed, the school which really formed Pepys's mind and made him into the very able man he was. So his whole childhood, his scenery has gone, and for Pepys, the pattern of your life, the shape of the life of your life is very, very important, and I think for him to see all that just gone was powerful and depressing.
Despite the devastation, there were only 6 official deaths during the fire of London. Amongst them, the baker's maid, the old woman sheltering in St. Paul's, and an 80-year-old watchmaker who had been too frightened to leave his own home. But as those who survived looked out over their ruined city, it was as if there was only one question to ask: who hath done this?
Oh, fire, 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 sing that half more.
After the fire, a ballad was sold on the streets commemorating the destruction. It was called "London Mourns in Ashes."
Old London that has stood in state as good 600 years, in 6 days' space. And alas, is burned and drowned in tears.
People had lost their homes and their livelihoods. A printer who had laboured for years over his 12 volumes of poetry in honour of Charles I saw the entire edition burnt. Alderman John Jeffreys of Bread Street Ward lost £20,000 worth of tobacco. Joseph Curtin, Pepys' bookseller, was made bankrupt, moving from £8,000 in profit to £3,000 in debt. A year later, Pepys wrote,
I hear Curtin, my bookseller, poor man, is dead. I believe of grief for his losses by the fire.
Thousands were ruined. The eradication of items in this inventory of linen and plates owned by the Turners Company is a graphic indication of the scale of the losses. All burnt. At the time, the annual income of the city was £12,000. The estimated cost of the fire was over 10 million. Up to 200,000 Londoners were made destitute. They became a gypsy population, some raising shelters in the ruins, others seeking refuge in nearby towns and villages. A royal proclamation insisted that people in the countryside took in the homeless.
The king made very effective use of proclamations during the whole issue of the fire and its immediate aftermath, mainly because it took Parliament then, just as today, an awful long time to decide things. It was incredibly important that fast, decisive action was taken, and the king achieved that through these proclamations, which essentially the king saying, right, this shall be done, and it was. And thank goodness he did, and it's really very much his use of proclamations that won him so many plaudits through his management of the fire.
The appearance of the king would have been crucial. Here he was, a firm smack of leadership, giving firm and clear orders to those surrounding in the unaffected bits of countryside that the people, the refugees, had to be supported. I think it would have been hugely helpful.
But this was far from a permanent solution. People had to be encouraged to go back, rebuild their homes, and restart their businesses if the city was to have any financial future.
The first steps are reassurance. The whole business of managing information and telling people, look, it is safe to go back. Now, we know in this case that there were fires burning for several days and possibly even weeks afterwards, but a lot of the buildings that remained, such as they were unsafe, and a lot of the ground was dangerous to walk upon because of rubble. In modern circumstances, the evacuations that I have seen, people have got to be persuaded that it is safe to go back. Once you've managed information, you have persuaded them that there are no more threats, then you've got to guide them back in and show them where their houses were, because an area that has been razed, either naturally or by other men, is very difficult to recognise. And once they're back in the area of their general house or business or whatever it is, it's hard to understand, well, this pile of bricks and rubble and timber used to be my shop, this was my livelihood, this was my home.
But those who returned were faced with a desperate situation. Houses that had been available for £40 per annum rose to £150 overnight. There were continual fears of new fires starting, of falling walls and collapsed roofs. Thieves and looters searched the vaults and cellars of buildings for valuables that had been hidden and mugged those who stood in their way. An apothecary's man, returning to survey his master's shop, was caught, whipped into a vault, stripped, beaten, and left for dead in the dark. More rapacious landlords insisted that people paid rent on the land even after their houses had been destroyed. One of the worst offenders was the Bishop of London.
My predecessor, Humphrey Henchman, a beard-wearing clergyman, as far as I can judge from the little that survived of him, he was not vastly imaginative. And certainly, in common with a lot of the other authorities in the City of London, the fire was a devastating blow, not to his personal income, but to the way in which the whole church ran. For instance, St. Bartholomew's Hospital depended upon the rents of over 100 tenements in the City of London. Although the hospital was spared by the fire, its economic base was not. So that was in crisis, even though it hadn't been touched by the flames. And the bishop had a lot of churches and a lot of clergy to maintain, and rather injudiciously, he attempted to charge the booksellers in particular, who'd suffered very heavy losses, by storing all their goods to the value of perhaps £150,000, which in today's money is millions, in the crypt of St. Paul's, where they had burnt merrily for several days.
This obscure 6-page pamphlet, published by a man with the pen name of Philanthropus Philogarthus, chronicles a 9-year battle to receive compensation for the fire. He appeals on behalf of the miserably singed citizens, asking Parliament for a special contribution in order to stop the merciless fury of their creditors upon them. 4 new debtors' prisons had been built by 1672, increasingly filled by those who could not and would not pay for the devastation. A series of fire courts were established to hear appeals for compensation, but before any monies were paid, the question of blame had to be resolved. Whose fault was it? For a staunchly Christian nation, God clearly had much to do with it.
It's incredibly difficult for us in our godless age to put ourselves back into the mindset of people living in Restoration London. To us, there is always someone to blame, someone to sue. There is always, if that fails, the government to blame. There's always a minister who has to resign. In those days, it simply wasn't like that. People had a much wider view of why catastrophes happened, and things were very much ordained by God. And if something really ghastly happened, like the whole of the city burnt down, there must have been some divine reason behind it. There must have been some God-given reason for it to happen.
Actually, there was one nonconformist divine who was even clearer about what the fire meant in theological terms. In preaching on the anniversary of the fire, a couple of years after 1666, this nonconformist divine said, well, it couldn't possibly have been a punishment for the blasphemy of Londoners, because if it had been, it would have started in the Billingsgate fish market, where the porters use very ripe language. It couldn't have been for degeneracy and sexual immorality, because it would have started in Drury Lane. And it couldn't have been a punishment for lying, because it would have started in Westminster Hall, where all the lawyers met. We know for sure that it was a punishment for gluttony, because it started in Pudding Lane and ended at Pie Corner.
Despite this divine explanation, there was also a need for a more worldly investigation into the causes of the fire. The prime suspect was clearly the baker, Thomas Fariner.
The most obvious place for a fire to start is a bakery. The very mechanism of baking bread in those Tudor, basically designed ovens was highly, highly dangerous, and everybody recognized that. This wasn't rocket science. Everybody knew that bakeries were dangerous. I mean, the king himself had his royal bakeries separated by a considerable distance from the royal houses themselves. I mean, at Hampton Court, for instance, the bakery was put 100 yards away from the main palace, because bakeries always burnt down. In fact, the Hampton Court bakery burnt down in Queen Elizabeth's reign. So bakeries were essentially dangerous places.
Under close questioning, Fariner insisted all fires had been put out, that the coals were raked up in the chimney, and that a number of baked meats had been found untouched in his oven several days later. He was adamant that the fire had begun remote from chimney and oven and was caused by arson. But if he was to avoid blame, a scapegoat was needed, and in 17th century England there were two main candidates, foreigners and Catholics. This strange broadside gives a bizarre insight into the way in which Roman Catholics were demonized. In the center, 8 of them are seen throwing hand grenades against the great globe of the world. In the upper corner, London burns while 2 groups of men whisper and rejoice below. The Pope sits on the right, fanning the flames from Rome with a pair of giant bellows. In the climate of paranoia after the fire, Catholics and foreigners were continually stopped in the streets. A Frenchman with tennis balls was attacked when people assumed them to be grenades. A Portuguese merchant was suspected after picking up a piece of bread in a suspicious manner. And then, miraculously, a scapegoat presented himself. A group of foreigners were stopped on the coast of Essex. When questioned as to their whereabouts on the night the fire began, one of their number immediately confessed to having started it. Robert Hubert was a 26-year-old watchmaker from Rouen, a foreigner who conveniently claimed that he was also a Roman Catholic. He told all who were willing to listen that he had arrived only a few days before the fire on a Swedish ship and had visited the bakery on the night of September the 2nd with a friend. They had carried 3 fireballs, one of which Hubert claimed to have thrown through the bakery window, in order to start the fire. But when he was brought to trial, it became clear that the facts did not add up. Thomas Fariner admitted that his bakery had no window through which a fireball could have been thrown. The ship's captain claimed that Hubert had not disembarked until 2 days after the fire had begun. And Hubert himself was so crippled that he could hardly walk, as the defense noticed, for he had a dead palsy on one side, one arm useless, and much ado to trail one leg after him. It seemed an almost willful act of confession, yet such a state of mind is familiar to modern firefighters.
People do make false confessions sometimes. At a high-profile incident, it's sometimes a means of seeking to be the centre of attention or gaining some notoriety. It may be just blatant, obvious mental illness. That's sad, but it can be dealt with. But if a confession is remotely plausible, it has to be investigated thoroughly. And guilty persons may have a vested interest in that. In extreme cases, if a crime such as this obviously carries the death penalty, it could be a suicide attempt.
Hubert never explained why he had started the fire, but he was a highly convenient figure for Thomas Fariner, who was keen to encourage the prosecution. And so Hubert was found guilty by confession and hanged at Tyburn, becoming the fire's 7th official victim. But if he wasn't responsible, who was? How did the fire actually begin? By reconstructing the Pudding Lane bakery with original materials and building techniques, and by recreating the climate, the temperature, and the wind pattern on September the 2nd, 1666, it's now possible to conduct a detailed investigation into the progress of the fire. Although Fariner may well have raked out the upper oven, the ash pit in the lower oven and the floor of the bakery may well have contained smouldering embers left over from a busy day's work.
It's very easy to overlook something like an ember. At the end of the day, a baker would clean up, ready for the next day. He would scrape down his table. He might put some flour near the oven, which was still warm, to get it nice and warm if he was making a batch of manchet or French rolls the next morning. And he'd probably cover it with a muslin gauze or a cloth. And of course, something like that could catch fire very, very readily.
On that night in September, there were a number of highly combustible materials present, the most overlooked of which is flour. Flour is explosive. In hot environments and confined spaces, particles of flour can cluster together and spontaneously ignite. Dust explosions have been well known since the 19th century, but nobody has yet suggested that this could have contributed to the fire of London. At the time, white bread was a delicacy, a sign of wealth and status, and all the flour delivered to bakeries in this period was unrefined wholemeal. It needed to be sifted to separate the white flour. This process, called bolting, was often done late at night in preparation for baking the next day. The clouds of dust created by the bolting could easily have created a highly flammable haze in the bakery. Could Fariner have disturbed an ember when he left the room, starting the fire by igniting dust on the floor or flour in the atmosphere?
We know that flour now in the atmosphere can spontaneously combust. There's no evidence at all in any of the literature that they knew this, but intuitively I think they must have done, because they always cited the flour preparation area in a separate room, in a fair or a clean bolting house, which was kept scrupulously clean because they often sieved it onto the floor, and you get an extraordinary amount of dust in the air. It was always kept away from the ovens because A, the flour would get contaminated by the extraordinary amount of dust and soot that's created by one of these structures. But I feel they probably knew that there must have been some occasions when flour did ignite.
These dust tests show how suspended particles can spontaneously ignite, and that it doesn't take a large amount of flour or flame to create a disaster. There is one reported dust explosion every week in the United Kingdom. The presence of flour, together with smouldering embers, made this fire particularly dangerous. But what makes it unique is a combination of factors. For the fire was made even more hazardous by the proximity of a large number of combustible materials in a shop near the bakery in Pudding Lane. Materials recently unearthed by the archaeologist Gustav Milne.
These were all discovered in a huge dump of debris in a building in Pudding Lane, just around the corner from the bakehouse where the fire started. Now, the debris on the upper levels of our dump show that it must have been a shop, because we've got 30 identical pots which were on sale in the shop presumably, and all sorts of other little things like these hooks and eyes which are fused together in the heat. So that's what's being sold upstairs. But what interests us is what's in the basement. In the basement itself, on the cellar floor, was a great congealed black mass. And you can see the tide line of that congealed black mass here on this tin glazed tile, this very attractive tin glazed tile, which fell into the debris when it was still smouldering, when it was still hot, hence that tide line. Now, what we found in the cellar was the remains of 20 barrels, 20 timber barrels. You can see a stave carbonized from one of those barrels, and these barrels contained the black mass that filled the cellar. And that black mass we had analysed and we discovered was wood pitch, which is used as a waterproofing agent in the 17th century, but also is unfortunately very flammable. Now, this had spread out all over the floor, and here is one of the bricks from the floor, which, as you can see, has got some of that pitch still burnt on it. Now, if you've got a building with pitch barrels in it next to where a fire started, you can imagine what happened. The building went up like a bomb.
We took samples from Gustav Milne's archaeological dig to the building research establishment at Garston in Hertfordshire. Here we resubmitted surviving pitch, pottery and calcined brick from the Pudding Lane fire of 1666 to intense heat, remelting the objects in order to find out the actual temperatures present during the Great Fire. As the pitch and pottery melts, scientists are able to assess the heat flux on the surface of the object. Subjected to radiated heat at 3 joules per second, the pitch begins to smoulder. As the temperature rises from 600 to 900 degrees centigrade, the pitch blisters. By subjecting materials present in the fire to such extreme heat, and by creating similar climactic conditions, it's now possible to estimate the speed of the fire. The average wind speed for September 1666 was 7 knots per hour. Now, by exposing a section of thatch to temperatures of 900 degrees centigrade and a wind of 7 knots per hour, it's possible to time the speed of the fire over a small area. This data could then be combined both with contemporary accounts of the fire and with the spread in our reconstructed bakery. It measures 5 square meters. This is the fire after 1 minute. After 2 minutes. After 5 minutes. And after 20 minutes. The heat increases exponentially, reaching a spread of up to 20 square meters an hour. That's a rate of destruction of 1 terraced street every 4 hours. The heat is so intense and travels so in advance of the flames that buildings combust almost spontaneously. This was what Pepys noticed. The fire seemed to jump.
All over the Thames, with one's face in the wind, you were almost burned with a shower of fire drops. This is very true, so as houses were burned by these drops and flakes of fire, 3 or 4, nay, 5 or 6 houses, one from another. When we could endure no more upon the water, we to a little alehouse on the bankside, and there stayed till it was dark almost, and saw the fire grow. And as it grew darker, appeared more and more, and in corners and upon steeples, and between churches and houses, as far as we could see up the hill of the city, in a most horrid, bloody, malicious flame. It made me weep to see it.
It's clear from our tests that a number of factors were involved. Hot embers in a tinder-dry room filled with flour and other highly flammable materials, creating a fire that must have reached temperatures of over 900 degrees centigrade, spreading so fast that at its height, whole streets could burn in under 4 hours. Faced with such destruction, Londoners were confronted with what seemed like an insurmountable task. How would the city ever be rebuilt? London's fires have left a permanent mark on the city. Archaeologists working today can still find fire dumps and fire layers in their digs.
What we're looking at is the successive attempts of Londoners to keep their city going as buildings either fall down with age or are destroyed. Most of the buildings are built of wattle, built of clay and timber, and they caught fire incredibly easily and with monotonous regularity and burnt to the ground. As burning material falls on that actually fires, that bakes hard. Then over that you get the very characteristic red, orange debris from where the clay and timber walls have, as they're burning, the clay in that fires, it goes this bright orange colour, the whole thing collapses into and onto the floor of the building. So this very, very colourful sequence, yellow, black, red, orange, and then Londoners start all over again. Instead of sweeping this away, they rebuild directly on top of it. So you get a new bright yellow floor right on top of the sequence of firing and destruction. And the whole thing starts all over again until that building also in due time is destroyed.
The fire, of course, was a catastrophe, but on the other hand, it was the most sensational opportunity. Never before on a European scale had a fire like this happen. There'd been little fires all over in Milan and elsewhere, but this was virtually the destruction of one of the biggest cities in Europe. And so for people who were interested in these matters, for the architects and people who were interested in town planning, it was a fabulous opportunity. And for the king most of all, this was something his father or his grandfather would have dreamt of. Suddenly, in 1666, Charles II and his advisors had an opportunity to make a truly great modern European city. And for them, it was a gift from God.
Trade had to begin immediately if London was to regain any financial stability. By the 9th of October, owners of houses were given 14 days' notice to clear their foundations of rubbish so that an exact survey could be made. Several plans were submitted by Hooke, Evelyn, and Captain Valentine Knight, all suggesting a simplified grid system to replace the narrow winding lanes that had, in part, contributed to the spread of the fire. Hooke suggested clearing all the old streets away, creating a prototype of a modern American city. Evelyn imagined a stately waterfront and a city with piazzas around the most prominent buildings. Valentine Knight proposed a 30-foot wide canal to provide extra revenue for the king, who was so horrified by the idea that he should profit from the fire that he had Knight imprisoned. But the rebuilding of London is almost entirely associated with the work of Christopher Wren, a professional astronomer and amateur architect who had already designed the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford and planned the reconstruction of St. Paul's.
All of those plans propose razing and obliterating the old city and replacing it with some grandiose new schemes. Some of them are grid-like. Wren's has focal points and then rays of streets coming out from these focal points. Very grand, down to the river, and the king evidently liked it.
Just over a year before the Great Fire, Charles II had sent Sir Christopher Wren to Paris. And he'd sent him to Paris to look at the Louvre, because what Charles wanted to do was imitate what was going on in France, and he wanted to build a great metropolitan palace. He wanted to tear down old medieval Whitehall and build something on a European scale. And that's why Wren went to France.
Wren spent 9 months in France. He looked closely at all the buildings that were going up there, but most importantly, he watched the way in which something like the Louvre was constructed, the way in which huge teams of workmen who were semi-skilled themselves were put together and harnessed by very able overseers to put up these extraordinarily dramatic buildings.
Wren's design was a spectacular attempt to provide Londoners with a beautifully designed and integrated city. The capital could have rivaled Paris, Venice or Rome, but it just didn't.
Looking at the plans produced by Sir Christopher Wren, Evelyn and others immediately after the fire, one's often tempted to ask, well, why weren't they built? Wouldn't it have been so much better for London if we'd had one of these idealised layouts? Well, the answer really is very simple. Property rights. It was essential for the people who own these houses to get them rebuilt and start trading immediately. And that is why, above all other reasons, post-fire London was built on a plan that was almost indistinguishable from that of the medieval city.
London became a building site as surveyors marked plots and staked out foundations, although some people moved the stakes by dead of night in order to increase the size of their property. By the beginning of 1668, 1,200 houses had been built. Although Wren could not influence their design or layout, there was one area in which his ideals could possibly be met: the city churches.
The project to rebuild London's burnt churches was one which was arrived at late in the day in terms of rebuilding the city, so that the householders had got their houses back up on the plots they had occupied. Roads had been widened, but now the sites for the churches were the highly constrained sites on which the old churches, which would now be demolished, had stood.
This means that in so many of Wren's churches, they encapsulate the medieval ground plan as well as a lot of the medieval stonework. And in some churches, like for example St Vedas, just round the corner from St Paul's, they've actually encapsulated some of the upstanding masonry. We've actually got a whole slab of upstanding wall from one of the medieval churches. So Wren's churches are not just remarkable Baroque architecture, they're also medieval architecture as well. So we get two monuments for the price of one.
Wren, above all, wanted the internal space to look like a pure space with right angles, cubes, hemispherical arches, and he achieved that by a kind of optical illusion. His plans look very curious. It's only in the three dimensions, when you actually stand in a Wren church, that you feel the sense of a perfect space.
Despite Wren's prolific building and design, there was still one ambition remaining that excited him above all other: the reconstruction of St Paul's Cathedral. Here, Wren the astronomer could combine with Wren the architect to create an extraordinary fusion of science and religion. He and his friend Robert Hooke were convinced that they could use a tower in the West End for a series of pendulum and barometer experiments, and the dome as an astronomical observatory.
It was an irresistible opportunity to build a dual-purpose building, a large-scale astronomical instrument, and a house of God. It was irresistible because it was a unique opportunity to provide on such a scale the kind of height and the kind of aperture on the sky which would enable an astronomer like Wren to conduct experiments that hitherto he could only dream of.
But even here, as he attempted to realize his scientific and architectural ambitions, Wren was faced with conflicting demands and ideas.
There were four really big things that dominated the whole consideration of the design of St Paul's. The first, I think, was one that we can attribute to Wren and to the King. I mean, they wanted a modern building. They wanted something that stylistically was going to be set way apart from the Gothic cathedral. They'd both seen France, had been both very influenced by France, and they wanted to have something that was going to set London on the European map. Then we had the clergy, and there was a tension inevitably between Wren and the King and the clergy. The clergy wanted something that was going to work liturgically, something that was going to be suitable for the first Anglican cathedral, because that's essentially what this building was. And then there was the city, and what the city wanted essentially was a status symbol. And the old cathedral had been the great status symbol of medieval London, and as this wonderful new city arose, the Corporation of London was determined that the new cathedral would set London on a European map. And finally, there was money. Of course, the cathedral had to be affordable. In fact, to begin with, the idea was that the cathedral should be built in parts. They should first of all build the east end, then should build the transepts, should build the middle, and the whole business was down to cash flow, and the cash had to carry on flowing, so money was terribly important. And within those four parameters, Wren had to try and build a design that pleased all four of those together.
It took Wren years to reconcile the conflicting interests, deciding finally to build a detailed scale model in order to sell his ideas to each of the interested parties, most particularly the King.
This model was completed a full 8 years after Old St Paul's had been destroyed in the Great Fire. We'd had prevarication, procrastination, the Anglican Church not happy with what the King wanted, Wren not happy with what the Church wanted. This was the point at which Wren was going to hit the king with the grandiosity, the magnificence of the promised new cathedral, and all the loving care that went into making this model, a year's worth of work on the part of the model makers, was worth every moment of that time if the king would gasp at this interior and the perfectly crafted little altar at the end, and imagine himself, as I stand at this level, looking upwards at the Great Dome. This would be a cathedral rising from the flames, resurgam, the phoenix rising. The king would agree and give Wren his charter, his warrant to build the cathedral.
Wren finally secured approval for his royal warrant design in 1675, but problems remained in deciding how the building should be topped out.
Even though London's skyline has changed unrecognisably from Wren's time, the Dome of St Paul still in some way dominates. In some way it's the focus of our view of London. But of course in 1666 no one had ever seen a dome before. It was a completely new architectural feature. And this is one of the reasons why the city was so keen that it should be enormous. They wanted this vast new status symbol. But this did give Wren a problem, because the size outside and the size inside simply couldn't be the same. It would be far too large inside the cathedral if they had this massive dominating feature on the skyline. And so Wren came up with a very simple solution, a very clever solution, which is essentially to build two domes. A small one inside and a large one outside, and a gap between the two. And that's what we've got there today. A double dome structure which solved the tension between the city's desire for a huge silhouette and Wren's imperative to have something that worked from the inside.
When you look at St Paul's on the skyline, you have a sense of its beauty. What you get here, between the cone and the outer dome, is the immensity of the scale. The scale, as you feel it in here, is beyond anything imaginable. And in terms of pre-fire London, it is truly unimaginable. The broken spire of old St Paul's stood for that ambition, failed on the old cathedral, but here it stands. All those centuries later, it succeeded here, and this space shows you why it succeeded. It was structure, it was engineering, it's a void like no other.
Almost unique in cathedral architecture, St Paul's had been built under one architect over a period of 35 years. For the painter William Hogarth, it was the epitome of beauty. There you may see the utmost variety without confusion, simplicity without nakedness, richness without tawdriness, distinctness without hardness, and quantity without excess. He called Wren the Prince of Architecture. The fire is commemorated by the monument. Designed by Hooke and built by Wren, it serves as a permanent reminder of the way in which the city was changed by fire from the medieval into the modern world. There is, however, one final irony. Before the basket was placed around its top, the monument had become a popular destination for suicides. Its first victim threw himself off in 1788. He was a baker.
The Channel 4 book, A Century of Troubles, is available now, priced $18.99. To order your copy, call 0870 1234 344. You can also explore the 17th century further at channel4.com/history. Next tonight, how a chemical cloud killed thousands in Bhopal in 1984. Going Critical is next on 4.